How's it going, hipsters? Best mustache in the game. Blake back at it again. Today I'm doing another deck tech with y'all, and this time it's going to be on one of my personal decks, Nissa Vastwood Seer. This is a mono green lands based deck, based specifically around the card Field of the Dead. It's a pretty insanely powerful card. I've talked a lot of hype about it, and this is kind of the deck I built around it to try to really push the limits and see how far you can go with Field of the Dead, how much of a restriction it is on your deck building. So I thought that this would be a fun, interesting deck to kind of talk about, as most of my other deck tech videos, even though I go over most of the lands, I don't really reference why I'm making a lot of the land choices that I do. In this deck, almost every land is very specifically chosen, as well as all the other cards. So I think it might help give you guys a better idea of constructing your mana bases in order to, maximize them and that sort of thing. So, do the normal algorithm stuff, like, comment, subscribe. And yeah, let's just get into it. Thanks for being here. Love y'all. All right, so let's start off with the commander, Nissa Vastwood Seer. What she does is she's an Elf Scout legendary creature, 2 and a green for a 2/2. When she enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a basic forest card, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, if you control 7 or more lands, exile Nissa, then return her to the battlefield transformed under her owner's control. And she flips into Nissa Sage Animist, which is a 3 loyalty planeswalker. +1, reveal the top card of your library. If it's a land card, put it onto the battlefield. Otherwise, put it into your hand. -2, put a legendary 4/4 green elemental creature token named Ashaya the Awoken World onto the battlefield. Or -7, untap up to 6 target lands. They become 6/6 elemental creatures. They're still lands. So this is just kind of a pretty simple value card. On the front side, when you cast it, you get a land out of your deck, so it kind of draws a card. And then on the back side, you have a plus ability that Coiling Oracles. You draw a card or put a land into play. And then you have some other stuff on here. Make a 4/4, make some 6/6s, whatever. So this is just a a generic value card that cares about lands, hitting land drops, that sort of stuff. I've always really liked this card. I've always thought the rate on this card was quite good. It turns out with this deck, you actually kind of want Nissa to die once or twice early on, so that way you can replay her and draw another card, aka another land. So I kind of aggressively trade her off early on in the game and do that sort of stuff. But even though this card is a pretty simple card with just kind of normal sort of value stuff on it, don't underestimate this card. For only 3 mana, it does get you quite a bit of card, and it does get you consistent card draw on the backside of it, which you will very reliably flip in this deck. The whole point of this deck is to play as many lands, hit as many land drops as we can. So yeah, that's the commander, Nissa Vastwood Seer. So we're going to kind of go through this in order that we listed off here. I didn't really play with too many tags much because I plan on talking about every card here anyway. So yeah, and everything kind of revolves around the land strategy. So almost everything in the deck kind of centers around that, or, has extra synergy with the deck in some other way, which we'll obviously talk about. Secondarily, we have one other planeswalker actually in the deck, and it's Nissa Who Shakes the World. 3 green for a 5 loyalty planeswalker. It has a static ability. Whenever you tap a forest for mana, add an additional green. +1, put 3/1 counters on up to 1 target non-creature land you control. Untap it, it becomes a 0/0 with Vigilance and Haste. That's still a land. -8, you get some lands out of your deck or whatever. So yeah, this just helps ramp us, makes our forest produce extra mana. Notably, we don't have to untap a forest with this +1 ability. We have some lands that can make much more than 2 mana on them. So yeah, the +1 is what we're here for, and the static ability, obviously. I found this card, I wasn't sure about this card, but I was like, because I'm not running a ton of forests. I'm only running like 16 or 17 forests. But this card seemed like it would still be good enough, and it definitely has been plenty good enough. So I've been happy with the inclusion here. This is definitely a planeswalker worth running. All right, let's get into the creatures. Most of these creatures are to support land payoffs, allow me to play additional lands, recur lands from the graveyard, all that sort of stuff. And then there's a handful of interactive creatures and kind of a toolboxy sort of creature base here. So first up, we have Ancient Green Warden. It's 4 green for an elemental 5/7. It has reach. You may play lands from your graveyard. If a land entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. So with our kind of signature lands that we have in the deck, this is great. Also, we have tons of landfall payoff sort of cards, so those will all trigger an additional time here. Being able to play lands from the graveyard is obviously a big thing that we want to do. We want to be able to replay our fetch lands and all those sort of things we'll get into. And then the reach is nothing here. Green usually has a hard time dealing with flyers because they don't really have very many flyers. So anytime I can get sort of incidental reach to kind of help protect my life total because I don't have a lot of life gain in this deck, then I'm happy to have it. But yeah, Ancient Green Warden is definitely a welcome addition to the deck. Avenger Zendikar, a classic. 5 green for a 5/5. When it enters the battlefield, you make 0/1 plants equal to the number of lands you control. Landfall, you put a 1/1 counter on all of your plants. This card just builds an army on its own. We can very easily make all of our plants huge with this deck. So this is definitely a very big threat that also goes wide, so it provides us with a lot of material. Just a great classic lands card. Azusa, Lost But Seeking, 2 and a green for a 1/2 human monk, legendary creature. You may play 2 additional lands each of your turns. Extremely powerful. You do have to have the lands to fuel it, but ideally we will, and we plan to. I'm playing quite a few lands, and I'm planning on adding more. I've cut a few recently to try out some new cards, and I've been kind of regretting it. I kind of want to put lands back in it because I'm only at 42 lands. So yeah, ideally I'd want that number to be quite a bit higher. I'm going to shoot to add probably 3 more lands. I wanted that number to be 45 realistically. But yeah, Azusa, Lost But Seeking, definitely not one of the cards that's going to get cut. Insanely powerful. Allows us to play tons of additional lands and hit all of our landfall triggers. Courser of Crufix, 1 green for a 2/4 enchantment creature centaur. Play the top card of your library revealed. You may play the top card of your library if it's a land. Whenever land enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life. Whenever you play a land off the top of your library with this card, it's basically like you drew a card because that card wasn't in your hand and you got a card. It's very easy for us to deploy the lands that are in our hand onto the battlefield with this deck because we have a ton of cards that let us play extra lands. But this kind of gives us the extra draw effect of being able to play the lands off the top of our deck. And the incidental life gain is really nice. It actually adds up quite a bit pretty quickly in this deck as we play a lot of lands. So yeah, Courser, it's kind of, not the most exciting card, but it's been a very good role player. Druid of Purification. This is a new one that I've added. 3 and a green for a 2/3 human druid. Whenever it enters the battlefield, starting with you, each player may choose an artifact or enchantment you don't control. Destroy each permanent chosen this way. So you're going to destroy, something on the battlefield, whatever the biggest threat to you is, or, the second biggest threat. And then as soon as one of your other opponents decide to blow up one of the other opponents, artifacts or enchantments, then everybody's like, well, I might as well destroy your thing. I might as well destroy your thing. So this ends up just, being an upgraded Reclamation Sage, a pretty heavily upgraded Reclamation Sage. It is 1 more mana, but I definitely want some more artifact and enchantment interaction for this deck. And if I can put it in the form of a permanent, like Druid of Purification on a creature body, I'm definitely more inclined to do that as I have things that pay off creatures and stuff. So I haven't got to try this card out a lot because I've kind of just recently acquired it, but I'm very excited to try it out. It definitely, I've seen it in play in other decks, and it's always been an overperformer. So definitely excited to try it in my deck. Dryad of the Elysian Grove, 2 and a green for a 2/4 enchantment creature nymph. You may play an additional land on each of your turns. Lands you control are every basic land type in addition to their other types. Now you would think that the only ability I care about here is playing the additional land for each turn, but actually the second ability of my lands getting all land types is actually extremely relevant. What it allows me to do is tap my fetch lands for green mana when normally I have to crack them to get a basic land. And if I can do that and tap my fetch lands for mana, it allows me to maximize the number of different named lands I have on the battlefield, which is obviously extremely important for Field of the Dead. and can be hard sometimes in a monocolored deck because you still have to have a bunch of forests because almost every card in this deck needs green mana to cast it. And you know, it just gives you a ton of extra options. And allows you to kind of diversify. You can hold on to your fetch lands then until you actually play your Field of the Dead, then start cracking them as you meet your, you know, sort of name requirements for the Field of the Dead. So this card actually gives you a lot of play that you wouldn't initially think in this deck. Elvis Reclaimer. This has also been a recent add. 1 green mana for a 1/2 Elf Warrior. It gets +2/+2 if there are 3 or more land cards in your graveyard. You can pay 2, tap, and sack a land. Search your library for a land card, put it onto the battlefield, tap, then shuffle your library. I haven't really put this card in my lands decks traditionally. I've just thought it's just a little clunky and slow as it's on a creature, and you don't really want to be like wheeling away your lands early on to get just like whatever utility lands. So it feels kind of more. It's always kind of felt like more of a late gamey sort of card to me in lands decks, and then when it's a late gamey card, it's just kind of a slow late gamey cards. So I don't know, I never thought it would translate very well, but in this deck it's vastly overperformed my expectations. It's just allowed me to do a lot of the things I didn't expect, like early on in the game if I need land drops to hit, if I'm not drawing them and I kept, you know, a kind of loose hand. This allows me to, you know, sack a forest to get a bounce land to return the other land I had to my hand, so then I have another land drop next turn. Or I can get some of the busted lands in the deck if I'm already kind of starting to set up and get going. Obviously, it allows me to get my Field of the Dead, which is kind of my signature card in the deck. So, yeah, this card has just been an insane overperformer for me. I didn't expect much out of this card when I kind of threw it in the deck, but I wanted to try it out because I hadn't really. But it's been exceptional for sure. Next up, Endray's Forerunners, 5 green for a 7/7 boar. Vigilance, Trample, Haste. When it enters the battlefield, other creatures you control get +2/+2 and gain Vigilance and Trample till end of turn. This is the budget Craterhoof Behemoth. You'll notice that I don't have Craterhoof Behemoth in this deck. I'm just kind of bored with it at the moment. I just kind of want to play with some other cards and try some things out. This isn't like a Omega optimized deck or whatever. This is just kind of a fun, casual lands deck. It is quite good because it's a lands deck, so it's a hard, you know, axis of a deck to interact with. But, you know, I have fun with it. This is a card that I usually only play in like bulk or budget decks or whatever. But it turns out it's pretty good in just regular Commander. It works pretty well in this deck as a budget Craterhoof Behemoth. It still usually does the job. Yeah, it's been a card that I've enjoyed. If I got, you know, wanted to optimize this deck a bit more, sure, I would probably throw in Craterhoof Behemoth instead of this or something else. But yeah, I'm just kind of bored with it, so I'd throw in and then raise Forerunners instead, and it still does the job, but it makes combat at least a little more interesting, and I actually have to do math. So yeah, Endray's Forerunners, cool card. Next up, we got Endurance, 1 green for a 3/4 Elemental Incarnation. It has Flash, it has Reach. When it enters the battlefield, up to 1 target player puts all the cards from their graveyard on the bottom of their library in a random order. And you can also evoke this, which means you cast it, enters the battlefield, then sacks itself. And then you exile a green card from your hand to do that. This card is... I haven't had to use this very much. It's been another recent add to the deck. But whenever I've had it in my hand, I've always felt so safe. So one thing that this deck kind of struggles with is Graveyard Hate. Because about the only land I have that I can use for Graveyard Hate is Scavenger Grounds. And I do use my graveyard a lot. I like to sack my lands and, you know, recur them with things like the Ancient Green Warden and some other cards we'll get into. So I don't really want... I feel like kind of bad running Scavenger Grounds. Right now it's in the sideboard, which we'll get into later. But whenever I have this in my hand, I feel so safe from graveyard players. Because if they ever actually do anything, I can just throw away any green card in my hand and get rid of their graveyard. I can flash it in if I want a pretty good blocker because it has reach. And it's got a really good rate of a 3/4 for 3. So I'm never really out very much while I hold this up, but I always feel so safe when I have this card in my hand. Feel safe from attacks, feel safe from degenerate graveyard shenanigans. So yeah, this is... Even though I haven't had to cast this card yet very much, it's been a good card for sure. Definitely look forward to trying this one out some more. Next up, Eternal Witness, another classic. 1 green for a 2/1 Human Shaman. When it enters the battlefield, you may return target card from your graveyard to your hand. Simple. If I need to hit my land drops, I can hit them with this. If I need to get back some important piece, like a overrun effect like the Endray's Forerunners, You know, it does all the things that Eternal Witness does. You just get your best card that you've played back so far this game. Don't need a lot of reason to run it in this deck, but it's part of our utility package with another card we're going to get into here pretty soon. Next up, we have Kamal, Heart of Krosan. 6 green for a 5/5 human druid legendary. At the beginning of combat on your turn, creatures you control get +3/+3 and gain trample until end of turn. 1 in a green until end of turn. Target land you control becomes a 1/1 elemental creature token with vigilance, indestructible, and haste. It's still a land. This has been kind of another I don't really feel like running Crater Hoof sort of card. But this card has been surprisingly good. Going to combat and getting an overrun is quite good. And then I have a bunch of lands lying around. I have tons of mana, so why not turn them into creatures that turn into 4/4s and are great attackers? And you can still use the land in second main as well if you want to, because they have vigilance. So it's pretty sweet. This card's been fun. It's been a good card. Been impressed with it. Next up, Kodama of the East Tree. 4 green for a 6/6 legendary spirit. It has reach. Once again, very important. Whenever another permanent enters the battlefield under your control, if it wasn't put there onto the battlefield with this ability, you may put a permanent card with equal or lesser mana cost from your hand onto the battlefield. So this is just a great value card. Like I said, great blocker. 6/6 with reach is very important for us. We do actually have some combo lines with this card around a specific land. We'll go ahead and skip to it now just to kind of show it off. Guildless Commons. It's a land that enters the battlefield tapped. When it enters the battlefield, you return a land you control to its owner's hand, and it taps for 2 colorless. So it's a traditional bounce land, just like an Izzet Boiler Works or Dimir Aqueduct or any of those. The traditional bounce land, Simic Growth Chamber or whatever. But this one's colorless, so you can put it in any deck. So I can actually put it in this deck. And how it combos with Kodama of the East Tree is you need Kodama of the East Tree, the Guildless Commons, and then any sort of card that produces a token whenever a land enters the battlefield. So whether that's something like a Scoot Swarm, where it makes insects, or a Tireless Provisioner, where it makes food or clues, Tireless Tracker, where it makes clues, food or treasure, sorry. Any of those sort of things, anything that makes a token a permanent whenever you play the bounce land. What you do is you use the bounce land, you play it, Kodama triggers, and then whatever you have to make a token also triggers. You resolve the create a token trigger. First you resolve the land to bounce the land, and you bounce itself. Then you resolve the Kodama trigger. You'll resolve the Kodama trigger, makes a token, triggers Kodama to put something that is same mana cost of 0 that wasn't put in the battlefield with Kodama. Then you can put the land back into play. Then you repeat that. You bounce the land to your hand with itself, make a token. The token triggers Kodama. Then you can put the land back into play. Pretty simple loop. But what it allows you to do is get infinite of whatever the thing that you have making the token is. So if it's a Scoot Swarm, you'll get infinite Scoots. If it's a Tireless Provisioner, you can get infinite treasures and foods. If it's Tireless Tracker, you can get infinite clues, and so on and so forth. So not necessarily a game-ending combo, but it's going to make it really hard to lose. And they're both just all independently good cards in the deck. So I don't really feel that bad running them. It's a pretty easy combo to interrupt. It's just a creature, probably 2 creatures because the other thing's going to be making it permanent. This also works with Field of the Dead itself. If you make the zombie token from the land entering, then the Field of the Dead will also start this loop, which is kind of the reason I decided to add it, because the deck's centered around Field of the Dead. So it's just a cool card, really good value, really great blocker, and it also has some combo lines in the deck. So great card. Next up, we got Lotus Cobra. 1 in a green for a 2/1 snake. Land enters the battlefield under your control. You add 1 mana of any color. Obviously, we're going to add green every time. But this card is insanely powerful. Whenever you play a fetch land, which we have a ton of, you get 2 green from this. Whenever you have land enter the battlefield from any sort of our rampant growth effects and that sort of stuff, you get extra mana to cast more ramp spells or whatever. Lotus Cobra is just insanely powerful. It just makes so much mana. It won't just make 1 a turn for you, especially in a landfall deck. Next up, another classic lands card, Oracle of Moldiah. 3 and a green for a 2/2 Elf Shaman. You may play an additional land on each of your turns. Play the top card of your library revealed. You may play lands from the top of your library. This card is very consistent card draw. Notably, we do have modal DFCs in this deck, which you know I love and talk high praise on. If you reveal a modal DFC from the top of your deck, you can play the land side of it, just FYI, because this says you can play lands from the top of your deck. So, you know, pretty cool interaction. You could also do the same thing with Crucible of Worlds. If the card is in your graveyard, if a card says you can play a land from your graveyard, you can choose to play that card specifically as the land side. So fun fact for you. But needless to say, Oracle of Moldiah is a very strong card for sure. Next up, we have Ramming Up Excavator. Speaking of Crucible, 2 and a green for a 2/3 Naga Cleric. You may play lands from your graveyard. Very good effect for us. Allows us to consistently hit our land drops, as we'll consistently have fetch lands and other sort of lands in our graveyard that we sack to do other things. So yeah, Ramming Up Excavator, great card. We want as many of this effect as we can get in this deck. Next up, Reclamation Sage. 2 and a green for a 2/1 Elf Shaman. When it's the battlefield, you destroy a target artifact or enchantment. Once again, another classic commander staple. Once part of our utility package here. Sakura Tribe Elder. Steve doesn't really need an introduction, but either way, we'll read him off here. 1 and a green for a 1/1 Snake Shaman. You can sack him to search a library for a basic land, put on the battlefield, tap, then shuffle. Great card, 2 mana ramp. It's also on a creature body. We love to see that. Next up, Scoot Swarm, mentioned earlier. 2 and a green for a 1/1 insect. Landfall, when the land enters the battlefield under you control, you make a 1/1 green insect token. If you control 6 or more lands, you make a copy of this instead. So they increase exponentially. The first land you play, you'll have 2 Scoot Swarms. The second land you play, you'll have 4 Scoot Swarms. The next land, 8, 16, 32, so on. So this can cascade out of control really quickly. And then any sort of pump effect like the Kamal Heart of Krosa or the Endrace Forerunners, and all of a sudden everybody's dead. So Scoot Swarm, been a good card. Still just dies to a board wipe, obviously. Board wipe will clean up all these little 1/1s, no problem. But it's been a fun card. I've enjoyed it. I definitely wanted more things to work with the Kodama loop, and this is at least a way you can actually end the game with it. So yeah, Scoot Swarm's good. Next up, Spring Bloom Druid, 2 and a green for a 1/1. When it enters the battlefield, you can sack a land. If you do, you search library for 2 basic lands and you put them on the battlefield tapped. So it's mana ramp. It allows us to put a land in our graveyard, which we don't have a very hard time accessing. So it kind of helps us hit our land drops and ramp us in that way. And it's on a creature body, so we always appreciate that. Sylvan Safekeeper, 1 and green mana for a human wizard 1/1. You can sack a land to give target creature Shroud until end of turn, which means that nobody can target it with spells or abilities. This card is nice to protect sort of my utility creatures that give me payoffs for playing lands, whether that's Kodama or Lotus Cobra or whatever. It also protects itself. It can target itself. But what I actually really like about it is it allows me to kind of recycle lands if for some reason I don't have any in my graveyard and I need to, replay lands from my graveyard, or I need to hit my land drops for the turn, and I have a way to play lands from my graveyard. So it has some nice extra utility in that regard. For me, the main thing is that sort of effect and not so much protecting whatever random dorks I have lying around. Because most of them are pretty disposable and we can get them back fairly easy with our Eternal Witnesses or other cards that we'll talk about later. So the combination of those two kind of things together, only on a 1 mana investment here, makes it worth it for me. This card is kind of up for debate, though. I may end up cutting it eventually to try something else out. But this card has definitely pulled its weight, at least so far. Next up, we have our first modal DFC, Tingled Florahedron. It's a 1/1 for 1 and a green elemental. You can tap it for a green, or the backside is a tapped green land, Tangled Veil. So for us, we're almost always playing this as the land. But in a pinch, if we are flooded, which we aren't really ever worried about, but if for some reason we really need to ramp, then we can ramp with the front side. But just having a tap green source is plenty good enough for us because it has a very unique name of Tangled Veil. So it, helps us kind of get our different named lands out there. So in this deck, I'm playing almost every modal DFC except for the really bad ones, or the ones that don't really have any sort of payoff. So that's why I have 4 of the. I think there's 6 total that I could play in mono green, but I'm playing 4 of them. So that's how much I value them in this deck. Next up, we have the aforementioned Tireless Provisioner. 2 and a green for a 3/2 Elf Scout. Landfall, when a land enters the battlefield under your control, you can create a food or a treasure token. It's kind of like a slightly buffed up Lotus Cobra. We get a mana whenever we play a land. Every once in a while we might make a food. But it's, we get a Lotus Cobra, a second Lotus Cobra. This one we at least get to hold on to our mana for later if we want to. But it also gives us kind of an infinite loop with, what we were talking about earlier with Kodama. So that's the extra benefit. But this card is stellar. This card's been an overperformer for sure. Tireless Tracker, a classic 2 and a green for a 3/2 Human Scout. When it enters the battlefield under your control, you investigate, which means you make a clue token. Whenever you sacrifice a clue, you put a 1/1 counter on the tracker. Once again, another Kodama of the East Tree outlet. But in this deck, the clues are actually very important for us because we end up with a lot of mana a lot of the times. So just being able to, invest that into drawing more cards, I found myself doing a lot. A lot of times when I see people playing Tireless Tracker, they usually will just sit on a bunch of clues and then eventually maybe crack 1 or 2 of them, but they just kind of sit there all game. Even though I'll trigger this thing 6 or 7 times in a game and make that many clues, I will most of the time sack all those clues to draw cards because I just end up with that much mana and I need things to do. So Tireless Tracker is just an absolute all-star in this deck for sure. Next up, Titania Protector of Argoth, a commander of many of her own mono green lands decks. 3 green for a 5/3 legendary creature elemental. When she enters the battlefield, you return a land from your graveyard to the battlefield. Whenever a land you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you create a 5/3 elemental creature token. This card just makes an army very easily by itself. Also, it ramps the turn you play it because it gets you the land back, and you can use the land right away. So it helps you if somebody blows up your really powerful land that you have, or you just want to get a fetch land back to hit land drops, then Titania does it all, and she makes 5/3s along the way. So she's definitely a powerhouse for sure. Ulvenwald Hydra, 4 green for a star Hydra with reach. Its power and toughness equals to the number of lands you control. When it enters the battlefield, you search your library for a land card, put it on the battlefield tap, then shuffle your library. This card is probably not good enough for the deck, but I really like it. I have a lot of fun with the card. A giant reach creature is always really fun. Get you any land onto the battlefield immediately, so I can go get my Field of the Dead with this, or whatever other busted land I want to get. So it's just a cool card. It's a card I've always liked. I think it's cool. Realistically, I should probably cut it for power reasons or whatever, but I just like the card, so it's been in the deck for now. Wayward Swordtooth, 2 and a green for a 5/5 dinosaur. It has Ascend, which means you get the City's Blessing when you get 10 or more permanents on the battlefield. The dinosaur allows you to play an additional land each of your turns, and it can only attack and block when you have the City's Blessing. So it kind of just sits there like an enchantment for 3 mana for a little while, and then eventually it becomes a real creature where you can attack and block with it. I mostly just want it to be, 3 mana. I can play an additional land each turn. I'm totally fine with that rate, and that's how it acts most of the time. Eventually it might be an okay blocker or whatever, but it just allows me to play extra lands, and I want kind of as much of that effect as I can get. So obviously Wayward Swordtooth has been a good card for this deck. What else? 2 and a green for a 1/1 Elf Scout. When it enters the battlefield, you search the library for a forest card, put it on the battlefield, then shuffle. 3 mana ramp on a creature. Pretty cool. It also allows us to get a few really cool lands that we'll get into next. Some pretty cool kind of tech lands that we have to help trigger our Field of the Dead. So yeah, what else? Just a classic green card for Commander. And lastly, we'll get into the reason why I've been talking about kind of our toolboxy sort of stuff we have going on. It's Woodland Bellower, 4 green for a 6/5 beast. When this enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a non-legendary green creature with CMC 3 or less and put it onto the battlefield and then shuffle. This is a card that I've always liked. It's really good value, really good rate for the creature. And it gets us, with this sort of deck, the way we have it built, it kind of gets us anything. We can get Wood Elves for mana ramps, Cur Tribe Elder, Reclamation Sage if we need removal, ramming up Excavator if we need to be able to play lands from the graveyard, Sylvan Safekeeper if we need to put lands in the graveyard or protect special things that we have, Tireless Tracker and Provisioner if we need foods or clues or treasures or whatever. Lotus Cobra if we need tons of mana, Endurance if we need to graveyard hate, Ewood if we need to get something back from our graveyard, if we need to help recycle specific lands from our deck, we get Elvis Reclaimer, Courser of Crewfix. The sky's the limit sort of with this card. I have a lot of built around this card. That way I can kind of use it to get whatever I want to. As you'll notice, I don't really run very many tutors because I already spend so much time searching my deck, getting lands and stuff. I don't really want to waste everybody's time with playing a bunch of tutors and fiddling around. And, like I said, I'm not really playing on that power level. I can do powerful stuff with this deck, but I'm not trying to blow anybody out with this deck. I try to keep my tutors to a minimum, but this is one I run because it has a lot of cool utility and gives me really good flexibility through my deck. So it's a fun one to build around as well. As a card I've always liked. All right, next I'm going to move in. I'm going to skip over instant sorceries, artifacts, all that stuff, enchantments. I'm going to go to lands next because we keep referencing lands, and I think it's important to kind of talk about them next. So with my land suite here, I don't want to cut too many basics because I run a lot of basic land ramp, as I've kind of shown a little bit with the creatures, and I have plenty more of it coming up in the instant sorceries section. But I do need a decent number, so I'm running 15 basics. I have them split between 8 forests and 7 snow-covered forests to help maximize the number of different name lands for Field of the Dead. Anytime you're playing a Field of the Dead deck out there, everybody, I would recommend that you split half of your basics of whatever. So each color of basic that you have, take the number that you have and split it into half. So you run 2 snow-covered mountains, 2 mountains, 1 island, 2 snow islands, that sort of stuff. What that will help do is help trigger your Field of the Dead more consistently because you have, maximized number of different names in your deck. Important little tip there for you. So having said that, I'm running 15. That, to me, that has been a good number. I've found that to be enough going on. That being said, I do have 2 other forests in the deck that aren't basic forests, and that is Sap Seed Forest is the first one. So notably, this is not a basic land, but it does have the forest land type. So anything that says we can get a forest, we can get this land. It enters the battlefield tap. You can pay a green and tap it to gain a life. You can only activate this if you have 2 or more green permanents. Obviously, really garbage land, not really a land that I would ever be interested in playing in basically any circumstance. But I found it to be actually really good tech for this deck. If I have a way to search up a forest and I don't need that mana right then, I always grab this one or the next land. Because what it allows me to do is maximize, once again, the number of different named forests I control without having to, help pull all of the basic forests out of my deck to hurt the other cards that care about getting basics. Because if I just get a basic forest every time I fetch or every time I play one of those cards that allows me to get any forest, then it's going to, make the next versions of those cards quickly limit the number of cards I can get with it. So very important. This land is very important, as well as Gingerbread Cabin is the other forest that's not a basic forest in our deck. It enters the battlefield tapped unless you control 3 or more other forests. Obviously very easy in our deck. When it enters untapped, you create a food token. Very little payoff here, but once again, it's another basic it's another forest we can fetch in our deck that's not a basic forest and has a different name. So once again, it allows us to more easily maximize the number of different names of lands that we control. All right, so having said that, we have, I think, basically all of the playable fetches in green besides like the really bad ones like Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse. So I have all the green fetches, as well as Fabled Passage and Prismatic Vista. So I have Wooded Foothills, I have Windswept Heath, I have Verdant Catacombs, and I have Misty Rainforest. So all the ones that can fetch forests. Those can fetch, obviously, my basic forest or the other 2 forests. Very important. And then Prismatic Vista and Fabled Passage can obviously only fetch basic forests, but that's totally fine. We still need all the fetch lands we can get, because that puts another land in our graveyard that we can keep playing over and over with our graveyard land recursion. So excellent. We love those. Next up, we'll talk about some of our more on the utility side of lands. We have a lot of utility lands here, obviously. we'll just go from top to bottom here at this point. Those are kind of the core lands that I wanted to talk about that are a little bit more weird than just running a bunch of forests in your mono green deck, you know what I mean? So these are kind of the more utility lands. So first up we have Beside You Who Endures. It's a legendary land, it taps for a green. And then it has a lot of other words on it. You can pay 1 of the green to discard it, and then you can destroy an artifact, enchantment, or non-basic land an opponent controls. That player may search their library for a land card with a basic land type, put it on the battlefield, and shuffle. This ability costs 1 less to cast for each legendary creature you control. So most of the time it's just going to cost 1 green because we'll have our commander or whatever a random other creature sitting out there. But this is just interaction in a land slot. It puts the land in our graveyard because we just discard it, and then we can easily replay it with any of our land recursion. It's been an instant staple of the commander format for basically any deck that plays green because it's just a forest, basically. You can't fetch it, but it is just an untapped green source. So the cost of inclusion is very, very low. And the upside's extremely high. It answers most things. Enchantment land, enchantment artifact, or non-basic land. It's pretty sweet. They can go get it like a dual land or whatever, but who cares? You got rid of the thing that actually mattered, so. Next up is kind of an iffy one for me. It's Crawling Barrens. It taps for a colorless mana, or you can pay 4 generic mana and put 2/1/1 counters on this, and then you may have it become a creature. So you can kind of sit there and store up counters on it and make it a big idiot. This big idiot doesn't have any sort of evasion, though, so it is kind of boring. But I did want some mana lands in the deck, and this one's a pretty good mana sink. If you just have mana left over, you can just sink it into this and grow it a little bit. So it's been okay. It's probably a land that I'm interested in cutting for a better land, though. Next up, Deserted Temple. Taps for a colorless mana. You can pay 1 and tap it to untap target land. A lot of times in this deck, we have a land that produces more than 1 mana and sometimes a ton of mana, which we'll get into shortly. So this is just a nice way to ramp even more with a land. So it's been a good land. It's always a land that I've liked in my lands decks because typically I'll run a Gaia's Cradle or a Cabal Coffers or whatever that makes a ton of mana. So being able to occasionally untap that and make a ton more mana is pretty nice. Next up, Emergent Zone. It's a land that taps for a colorless mana, or you can pay 1 tap and sack the Emergent Zone, and then you can cast spells till the end of the turn as though they had flash. Surprisingly powerful. It allows you to interact at instant speed when you normally wouldn't be able to. Like I can actually hold up Rec Sages and things like that when I have this out. So that's pretty nice. You can surprise block people. If I am getting attacked with some giant flyer, I can flash surprise in, an Uffenwald Hydra or whatever, and also create a zombie by getting a Field of the Dead trigger or whatever. So there's a lot to be done with this card. It's always a card I've enjoyed, especially with decks that don't have an extra utility land slot and don't interact at instant speed very well. So good card. Try out Emergent Zone. Next up, we have Field of the Dead. I probably don't need to read it at this point for most people, but I'll go ahead and read it anyway. It enters the battlefield tapped. It produces a colored mana. And then whenever it or another land enters the battlefield under your control, if you control 7 or more lands with different names, create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. We just make an absolute army with this card like every turn once we hit this trigger, which we can pretty reliably do when we hit our 7th land. From my experience, I rarely don't have 7 different land names when I hit turn 7. Not turn 7, but whenever I hit my 7th land drop. So, Field of the Dead, super stellar card, kind of broken. And this is, like I said, this deck was kind of my ode to seeing how far you can push this card. Like, can I play a monocolored deck and consistently still have 7 different land names? Turns out, if you do a little bit of clever deck building, you definitely can. So yeah, I can very consistently have 7 different land names. Sometimes you gotta fiddle around with a little bit if you don't draw very many of your utility lands. Like I said, you might have to hang on to your fetch lands a little longer than you normally would. You don't just snap crack them immediately. You gotta think about it a little bit. But having said that, the payoff is worth it. And it definitely kind of encourages you to think a lot more about your sequencing and stuff. All right, the aforementioned Gaia's Cradle. Super broken card, one of the most broken cards in the format. It's a legendary land. It taps out a green for each creature you control. This thing often will produce 6+ mana easily on just an untapped land. You can do it immediately. So, super broken card. Easily the most powerful card in this deck. no doubt about it. But, you know, I'm a mono green deck. I'm a lands deck, so I'm going to play it even though it's a bit above the power level of a lot of the other cards in this deck. But I definitely want to play it either way. So this is kind of my concession in the deck to, you know, the deck is probably a little bit more powerful at times, but variants and stuff. Already talked about Gingerbread Cabin. Next up, we got Glacial Chasm. It's a land. When it enters the battlefield, you have to sack another land, or you sack this. It has cumulative upkeep, pay 2 life. So each turn you have to pay 2 life more, or you sack the land. So you pay 2 life the first time, your first upkeep with it, then to 4 life, then 6 life, then 8 life, and so on. You can't attack with your creatures, and all damage that would be dealt to you is reduced to 0. I'm just going to change the printing here real quick because it's will be easier for y'all to read. For whatever reason, they just gave me the basic one. I didn't really look over all the printings they gave me. Yeah, so cumulative upkeep, pay 2 life. When there's a battlefield, you sack land. Creatures you control can't attack and prevent all damage that would be dealt to you. This card is a really good role player in this deck. I don't really like the idea of running constant mists or fogs or anything like that. Because, I don't know, they're just dead cards most of the time. When they work, but, you know, constant miss is just kind of boring. It just kind of locks people out. If they're doing combat stuff, it doesn't really feel like you can interact with it in a meaningful way. But this card at least gives me the option of having a fog without, you know, kind of committing to playing those kind of dead cards most of the time. And this also has the extra upside of protecting you from burn spells or direct damage. Not loss of life, but any sort of other damage. So with this card on my deck, if I'm holding up like a crop rotation, or I can hold up my Elvis Rejuvenator activation, or any sort of instant speed land search activation, whenever I have that up, I feel like I can't die, because I can always just go get this. Unless somebody plays something that makes me lose an insane amount of life, which surprisingly, there's not a ton of cards that make people lose life in the Commander format. Most of it is damage. So, yeah, Glacial Chasm has been an overperformer. Usually when I start attacking with this deck, I amass a pretty big army, and then I start swinging in. So it's pretty easy to control this. Plus, when I want to, I can replay this from my graveyard pretty consistently. So if I want to attack for a turn, I can sack this at upkeep, and then replay it from my graveyard that same turn post-combat or something, and keep protecting myself. And then the sack a land to when this enters the battlefield is often upside for me, because it allows me to put a land back in my graveyard that I want to replay. For example, I can go, once I'm in my first main phase, tap Gaia's Cradle for a ton of mana, then play Glacial Chasm, sack the Gaia's Cradle, then I could replay it from my graveyard if I have extra land drops and play lands from my graveyard, which I often do, and then tap it for a bajillion mana again. So, lots of cute things that you can do with it. Sacking lands can be an upside in this deck. This card gives you a ton of protection for only taking up 1 slot in the deck. So, been an ultra overperformer for sure. Guildless Commons, we already talked about it. It's a really good role player in the deck, but it also works like a bounce line in any other deck. Helps you hit your land drops and kind of get pseudo card advantage, as this is 2 lands in 1. So, nice card for this deck. And it's really about the only reasonable bounce land we can play. I don't really want to play the Karoo for green. It's called like Jungle Basin or something. It enters the battlefield tapped, and you can produce a green and a colorless with it when you tap it. But when you play it, you have to return an untapped land to your hand. So it doesn't do the combo with Kodama because it can't bounce itself. And you will very quickly run out of untapped lands. So, yeah. Definitely not playing that one for that reason. But this one's definitely good enough to make the cut. Next up, another man land, Lair of the Hydra. If you control 2 or more other lands, it enters the battlefield tapped. It taps for a green, or you can pay X and a green until end of turn this becomes an XX creature. Still land. This card, I think, is much more likely to stay in the deck than Crawling Barrens, because the rate is just way better. The one nice thing about Crawling Barrens is you can kind of grow it as you have extra mana lying around. But this one, it's just way more efficient. Like, you only get half the mana you ever put into your Crawling Barrens back. Like, if I put 8 mana into it, it's just a 4/4. This, if I put 8 mana into it, it's a 7/7. Much, much better. And I don't have to, I just do it when I need to do it. But like I said, Crawling Barrens, you can at least do it when the mana's lying around. But this also produces green mana and stuff, so... Crawling, if I'm going to cut one of the main lands, Crawling Barrens is going to go first. I want to try this one a bit more. I've tried Crawling Barrens enough. I've been a bit unimpressed with it, but I think this one's a bit better. But as of right now, I just have those 2 main lands, so I probably will just end up keeping both of them until I find a better one to go in place of Crawling Barrens. Misty, we already talked about. Nykthos, this is the other land we have that can produce a ton of mana. It's a legendary land, taps for a colorless mana. You pay 2 tap, choose a color, add any amount of mana to your mana pool equal to your devotion to that color. We name green, we make like 10 green pretty easily. We are very permanent heavy in this deck. Our permanents have lots of green pips because green decks do that. So this will consistently make us a ton of mana. Once again, very good land. Not quite as busted as Gaia's Cradle, but will make us quite a bit of mana either way. Next up, another very important land in the deck, Petrified Field. It taps for a colorless mana, or you can tap and sack the Petrified Field to return target land from your graveyard to your hand. This is a very important card for the deck, as it allows us to kind of hold up instant speed ways to get lands back from our graveyard. So if we have this kind of just sitting out there untapped and we are holding up ways to play lands from our graveyard, so if you have like a ramming up Excavator out or something, and then next turn you're playing on untapping to play your Glacial Chasm from your graveyard, if somebody tries to stop you, if they try to do it on like the end step before your turn, they try to hate out your graveyard, you can tap and sack this in response to grab it from your graveyard, because nobody ever holds up 2 graveyard interaction cards at once, because people just don't have that many deck slots to do that. That being said, yeah, this is a very good land for that reason. It also can allow us to do some pretty goofy things with other cards in our deck, which we'll get into, where we give opponents choices between the number of which lands they give us, and this definitely limits the number of options that they have. So yeah, really good role player in the deck, allows us to recycle important lands that we normally wouldn't. If we channel a Boseiju early on as interaction, and we find that we need more interaction, we could return that to our hand and stuff. So really good role player, does a lot of different things, allows us to get all of our important lands back. So great card for the deck, really unique card. Not really anything else like it, so we're happy to have it. Talked about those. Next up, we got Strip Mine. Taps to make a colorless mana, or you can tap and sack to destroy target land. Very important card in the deck, as we can sometimes... I've never used it as a win condition yet, but in my other lands decks, I definitely have, where they used a very similar shell. If we need to, when we start getting down to a 1v1 or a 1v2 situation, all of our extra land drops that we have for turn, we can start strip mining all their important lands and slowly wear down their resources while we beat them down with whatever zombies that we have from our Field of the Dead and stuff. So, but most of the time, I just use it to blow up my opponent's Gaia's Cradles or whatever, you know, the normal things that you do is strip mine. You blow up problem lands. But with this deck, putting it in our graveyard is no problem. We can easily get it back, unlike most other decks. So, definitely happy to have this card. I've considered putting Wasteland in the deck too. But Strip Mine's been good enough for the extra utility of helping us be a win condition sometimes. Next up, Thespian Sage. Taps for a colorless mana, or you can pay 2 and tap Thespian Sage, and it becomes a copy of another land, except it has this ability. 99.9% of the time, it's just going to be a Field of the Dead, another Field of the Dead, which is very important for this deck, as it's their signature card. But every once in a while, we might need it to become like an opponent's bounce land or something if we need to ramp or something. And it still has this ability, so later we can change it into the Field of the Dead whenever we draw it. So, yep, Thespian Stage is definitely a second copy of Field of the Dead for the deck. And third copy of Field of the Dead in the deck is Vesuva. It's a land that enters the battlefield as a copy of any land on the battlefield, and it enters tapped. Notably, this isn't an ETB or anything like that. This works like a clone effect. It doesn't use the stack in any way. It's just your land for turn. The land doesn't use the stack. The ability to copy a land doesn't use the stack. So your opponents don't get to find out when you're playing this or what you're copying. It just kind of becomes that thing, which is pretty sweet little tech. Good thing to know. That being said, once again, this is just third copy of Field of the Dead. Ideally, we just hold this in our hand until we have Field of the Dead out, and then we play it. If you're real desperate, you can use it to play and copy your opponent's bounce land or broken land or whatever. If you need to hit land drops, you can copy forests and all that stuff. I wouldn't recommend copying basic forests because, once again, we want to maximize our names of Field of the Dead. So, but we have ways to recycle this and make it become a Field of the Dead later. As you've seen, we have ways to sack lands and stuff, so, and then play them from our graveyard. So, I typically like to hold on to this, but if I need a land to play, I will definitely play it. Then we have the 2 fetches we mentioned earlier. And lastly, a very important land for the deck, Yavimaya, Cradle of Growth. Legendary land, each land is a forest in addition to its other types. If you remember what we said about Dryad of the Elysian Grove, making our fetch lands into forests, basically. Same reason for Yavimaya being very important for this deck. It is a different land name that acts as a forest, but it makes all of our lands into forests. Therefore, we can tap our lands that we normally would have to sack to go get a forest. We can tap them for green and keep them around and keep our maximum number of different land names. So, very important role player in the deck. I found this to actually be, if I have an early game way to search up a land, any land, this is actually one of the first lands I tend to go grab for that reason. Because it makes the game run so much smoother. I don't have to think a lot about cracking fetches and making sure I hit this land drop at this time. I just play out my lands, I just tap them for green, and then later when I get my Field of the Dead online, then I can start, deciding when I want to fetch and do that sort of stuff. So, it's been a very, very important card in the deck, even though it seems, just like another forest or whatever. So, definitely a really sweet card. It really shows off how good this card is in this deck. All right, so that's kind of the land suite. The lands and the creatures are definitely our most important parts of the deck, as the creatures are the best payoff for the lands, and the lands are kind of the core of our deck. They're not just our mana source in this deck, they're actually part of our game plan. So those are the 2 most important things. And then the instant sorceries, artifacts, and enchantments. These are all just kind of supporting role cards. These kind of help us ramp, fill in the curve, and the ways that our creatures and stuff don't do quite as good as we would like. All right, so let's start with the sorceries. A lot of this is ramp some of its recursion and some of its interaction. Balaged Recovery is the first one. It's a modal DFC and probably the best one for green. It's Balaged Recovery is 2 and a green for a sorcery. Return target card from your graveyard to your hand. And then the backside is Balaged Sanctuary. It's a tapped green land. This is one that I won't hesitate to play as a tapped green source, obviously, because it has a different name. But having a regrowth effect in your hand in this deck, and any deck really, is very powerful. At 3 mana, that's a rate that I'm willing to take. I have plenty of mana lying around in this deck. This can do all the things that Eternal Witness does. Get me back win conditions. Get me back other better lands that I could need. Ramp spells, whatever I need. This card will do. And it just acts as a land when I don't need something special out of it. So definitely a stellar card. Cultivate, Commander staple. 2 and a green for a sorcery search library for 2 basic lands. Put one into the battlefield, tap the other into your hand. We want to make sure we hit all of our land drops, and this ramps us while doing that. So obviously great for this deck. Next up is Zuri's Predation. 5 green, 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 so 8 mana for a sorcery. For each creature your opponents control, you create a 4/4 green Phyrexian Beast creature token. Each of those tokens fight another different one of those creatures. So you make a 4/4 for each creature on the battlefield, and those 4/4s fight the thing that made them. Green doesn't really interact with creatures too well. And this is a card that I put in to help combat, like, go wide sort of decks outside of just Glacial Chasm. I haven't really had a good opportunity to try this card out, unfortunately. It's kind of more of a recent add, as I found myself kind of struggling sometimes with like a wide board of flyers, as we have a decent number of like spirit tribal decks and flying men sort of tribal decks. So even though I have a handful of reach blockers, sometimes they can only block one of an army of creatures. So it's been one of the weaknesses of this deck that I found. So I wanted some way to kind of help combat it. But I haven't been able to run into this card in those games yet. So we'll see. I'm still iffy on this card. And the mana on it is just kind of tough. That being said, with this deck, I don't have a lot of slots to dedicate to the limited creature removal that green has, because most of it's quite bad. But this has seemed like a good, like, sort of catch-all. It allows me to clean up all the garbage that's lying around that might be causing me trouble, like utility creatures or whatever, you know. So I'm interested in keeping this card in the deck for a little while and trying it out, but this is definitely one I'm interested in cutting. This might be one of the ones that I just cut for a land, another land for the deck or whatever. Next up, Finale of Devastation. X green for a sorcery. Search your library and or graveyard for a creature card with CMC X or less. Put it on the battlefield. If you search your library, you shuffle. If X is 10 or greater, creatures you control gain +10/+10 and gain haste until end of turn. This is just a super reliable win condition for us. We could easily get to that X equals 10 in this deck, and then pumping our entire team by +10/+10 and giving all our creatures haste almost assuredly kills at least one person, if not more. Because we're generally going to have an army of zombies that we just need to get a little bit bigger and help them get in there. Haste is also really big, as a lot of the zombies will enter and not be able to attack immediately. But also early game when we just need something to do, if we need ramp or ways to play lands from our graveyard or blockers or whatever. This is just a good card at any point in the game, basically, for us. So, yeah, Finale of Devastation, definitely one of the best cards in the deck, one of the better green cards in the format, for sure. Genesis Wave, one of my favorite cards. X green for a sorcery. Reveal the top X cards of your library. You may put any number of permanent cards with CMC X or less among them onto the battlefield. Then put all cards revealed this way that weren't put on the battlefield into your graveyard. So you just put the instants and sorceries into your graveyard that you reveal, basically. We have the vast majority of our deck is permanents. So most cards that we flip, we will put directly onto the battlefield. Notably, all the lands we put into play with this enter the battlefield untapped. So we get kind of a ritual. We get a pretty good rebate on the amount of mana that we spend. Plus, we get a ton of material. All of our landfall triggers are going to go crazy every time we play this card. Just one of my favorite green cards, period. And it's definitely in the right home here. We definitely need a way to sink our mana. And this sinks our mana while building us a huge board and even getting us plenty more landfall triggers and such. So definitely a pretty game-ending card, pretty powerful card. Hour of Promise, 4 and a green for a sorcery. Search your library for up to 2 land cards. Put them on the battlefield, tap and shuffle your library. Then if you control 3 or more deserts, you create some zombies. We're not going to control any deserts, but we are going to make some zombies when we play this card because it gets Field of the Dead in another land. So pretty good. The rate on it is fine. 5 mana to get 2 lands is fine. But the important thing is that we can go get our 2 busted lands. We can go get Field of the Dead and Thespian Stage. We can go get Field of the Dead and a bounce land if we need to start getting the combo thing going. We can get Nykthos, Gaia's Cradle, whatever we want. Obviously, the sky's the limit on this card. We have plenty of options. So, yeah, stellar card for sure. Kodama's Reach, you know what it does. It's the same thing as Cultivate. Nature's Lore, 1 in the green for a sorcery. Search your library for a forest card, put it on the battlefield, and shuffle. Forest does enter untapped, which is sweet, but this also allows us to get our 2 non-basic forests as well, which is super sweet. Those will obviously enter tapped unless we have meet the gingerbread cabin requirements. But, yep, it's just one of the best ramp cards in the format, period, so we play it here, and it has some extra utility as well. Nissa's Pilgrimage. This one reads really weird, but it's basically a Cultivate. You search your library for up to 2 basic forest cards, reveal them, put 1 on the battlefield, tapped, and the rest into your hand. If you have Spell Mastery, which means you have 2 or more instants of sorceries in your graveyard, you search your library for up to 3 basic forests instead of 2. You still put 1 on the battlefield, and the other 2 go to your hand. But that being said, in this deck, it's just an upgrade of Cultivate and Kodama's Reach, because we can only ever search for basic forests with those anyway. So every once in a while when we meet Spell Mastery, we get an extra basic forest out of the deal. So, you know, we'll take this effect. It's good. Next up, we have Nissa's Triumph. Pretty unique card to this deck specifically. This is the only deck that can really reliably trigger it, I would say. But when you do, it's very powerful. So it's green for a sorcery. You search your library for up to 2 basic forests, and then you put them into your hand. But if you control a Nissa Planeswalker, which we often will, because our commander can be a Nissa Planeswalker, you instead search your library for 3 land cards, any 3 land cards. So this card can be extremely powerful. As you can see, we have plenty of really powerful lands with all sorts of different powers and uses and such. So being able to get any 3 of them for just green is pretty insane. Notably, this doesn't work when it's Nissa Vastwood Seer. It only works when it's Nissa Sage Animist. But we very easily and reliably trigger that Nissa to flip pretty early as we ramp pretty insane in this deck. Ramp Growth, you know what it does. It's 2 mana, gets you a basic. Reshape the Earth, 6 green for a sorcery. Search your library for up to 10 land cards. Put them on the battlefield, tap, then shuffle your library. This just builds us a giant army of zombies while also getting us tons of like fetch lands, utility lands, protection lands, whatever we want. This card gets us insane mana advantage over everybody else while also producing a billion triggers for everything. Just an insanely powerful card in this deck. I haven't really tried this in too many other land stacks, but I could definitely see it going in a lot more land stacks now that I've played it here. That being said, this is definitely the best home for it, but I could see it seeing play other places too. Scape Shift, 2 green for sorcery. You sack any number of lands, and then you search your library for that many land cards, put on the battlefield, tap, then shuffle. So notably, this you choose what you want to sack and sack it to search for what you want when this resolves. So it's not like part of the cost. If somebody like flashes an opposition agent when you cast Escape Shift, you don't have to sack anything. You can basically just let the spell just fall away. You don't have to like lose all of your lands to an opposition agent or whatever. So just keep that in mind when you play this card. That being said, this doesn't just like auto win us the game like it would in like a deck that plays like I don't know, Valakut or whatever. It isn't necessarily a win condition for us, but it will build us a giant board and get us whatever utility lands we want in the same way that Reshape the Earth does. So yeah, obviously in the same way Reshape the Earth is good in this deck, this card's good in this deck. And we very reliably get all of our lands back. We can very reliably play our lands back from our graveyard. So, Seasons Past, 4 green for a sorcery. Return a number of cards with different converted mana costs from your graveyard to your hand, and then you put this card on the bottom of your library. So one thing I found in this deck is I could fairly frequently run out of things to do in my hand because I produce so much mana, but I can play so many things because I have so much mana. And then if somebody like board wipes or starts interacting a ton, then it can get a little awkward. I might run out of things to do. And this card just provides a ton of value and recursion, kind of all packed into one package. The fact that it's 6 mana isn't a big deal to me because it will usually get me a decent number of cards from my graveyard. And, you know, it can get me anything from a land that's really important back. It can get me utility creatures, spells, whatever, you know. It just gives me a lot of value kind of stapled into one card. And the fact that it puts itself on the bottom means I can go get it later. Again, draw it again later and get that value back. So yeah, I've just found Seasons Past to be a pretty good card in this deck. I've been kind of trying at different places to see where the home is, and this is definitely the home for it. I've been very happy with this card. Really cool card. It's a lot of people's pet cards. Not necessarily mine, but I do think it's a pretty sweet card, and it's been very good in this deck. I've been very happy with it. Obviously a bit clunky and slow, but the amount of value that it gives you is kind of unrivaled for the mana cost. I originally had Creeping Renaissance in this slot, which is a 5 mana sorcery that lets you get all of one permanent type back from your graveyard to your hand, and then it has flashback of 7 if I remember right. Maybe it's 4 and 7. I don't remember, something like that. I think it's 5 and 7. Anyway, I figured I would play that card and always name lands or whatever, or creatures. But there's a lot of times where I want to get back like a Escape Shift or a Genesis Wave again for my graveyard, and then maybe a creature, and then maybe a land, and, you know, a little bit of everything. So I didn't find that card performed very well for the deck, and I figured to try this card instead, and this definitely fit the bill for what I was looking for. It's just a lot of material on one card, and it's recursive, which we have some ways to recur things from our graveyard to our hand, but not en masse, not with like a bunch of things. So this has definitely fit that slot very well. I've been very happy with it. Next up, Shamanic Revelation. 3 green for a sorcery. Draw a card for each creature you control. Ferocious, you gain 4 life for each creature you control with power 4 or greater. Both sections of this card are very nice for us. We will typically have a ton of creatures out with our Field of the Dead and stuff, so this will usually draw us quite a few cards. So it's a 1 card, refuel our hand sort of card. Plus it'll gain us some life here and there, which, like I said earlier, I don't have a ton of life gain in this deck. So any sort of extra life gain I can get to kind of help stave off damage here and there is appreciated. So yeah, Once again, it's kind of a draw a new hand in a card sort of thing, and we need a couple of those in this deck because mana is not really a problem. Sky Shroud Claim, 3 and a green for a sorcery. Search your library for up to 2 forest cards. Put them on the battlefield, then shuffle your library. Once again, the forests enter untapped, so you can get any forest, so we can get our non-basic forests if we want, or if we need the mana, we can get the just regular basic forests. Splendid Reclamation, 3 and a green for a sorcery. Return all lands from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. Stellar card, obviously staple of lands decks. Very importantly, we have the art with Nissa on it for this version. But that being said, obviously super stellar card in this deck. Works really well with Escape Shift and a lot of the other cards we've talked about. Sylvan Scrying, 1 and a green for sorcery. Search your library for a land card, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle. For all the same reasons, all of our search for any land cards are good. This one is also good. 3 visits, same card as Nature's Lore. You search your library for a forest for 2 mana and you put it on the battlefield. Once again, basically the best ramp cards in the format or between these two, so happy to have them. Another modal DFC. This one's got a lot of words on it. Turn Timber Symbiosis, 4 green for a sorcery. Look at the top 7 cards of your library. You may put a creature card from among them onto the battlefield. If the card has converted mana cost 3 or less, it enters the battlefield with an additional 1/1 counter on it. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. Looking at 7 cards is a lot, especially when we're playing 28 creatures. We're basic, almost, I don't know what the odds are, but I think we're basically guaranteed to hit one almost at any point in the game. So that's nice. If we really need something to do, we can spend 7 mana and get a creature. So, you know, that's cool. But the more important part of this card is it's a land that taps for a green that enters tap, but you can pay 3 life to make it untapped. So this is the modal DFC that actually enters untapped, which is really sweet. So obviously that's the reason we play it. It's a land 95% of the time, but sometimes we play it as a spell if we really need to. So it's cool. All right, we have 6 instants, a few, just little things here. We'll get into it. Beast Within. It's a catch-all removal spell. It's one of the few ways that we have to deal with creatures reliably. It's 2 and a green for an instant. You destroy a permanent, and its controller gets a 3/3 green beast. Green doesn't really do this effect, so this is the only version of this that they've really given us, so we'll take it. We're happy to have it. Next up, we have Crop Rotation. 1 green mana instant. As an additional cost to cast it, you sack a land. You search your library for a land card, put it on the battlefield, then shuffle your library. Super broken land tutor for land decks. As we've talked about, getting lands of any type is really important for us, and sacking a land can be upside for us. And the fact that you can do this at instant speed, so if somebody's alpha striking at you or something and you're in danger, you can cast this and go get your Glacial Chasm and save your own life and, do all the stuff that we want to do in our deck. Crop Rotation, definitely one of the best cards in the deck. Colony Ambush, 2 and a green for an instant. It's a modal DFC. Target creature you control fights target creature you don't control, and the backside is a tapped green source. So this is one of the few ways to interact creatures that's worth running in green, because it's just a land. And if we really need to kill a creature, it's 3 mana to have something fight, which is not a very good rate, but it's a rate that's acceptable on a land. So yeah, Colony Ambush, another great modal DFC. Nature's Claim, 1 green mana for instant, destroy target artifact or enchantment. Its controller gains 4 life. One of the best removal spells in green, besides Beast Within. Super efficient rate, instant speed. We need some interaction, and this does it better than just about anything. Realms Uncharted. This is a really cute card. It's an instant for 2 and a green. Search your library for 4 land cards with different names. Reveal them. An opponent chooses 2 of those cards. You put the chosen cards in your graveyard and the rest in your hand. Then you shuffle your library. So you reveal 4 lands to your opponent. Your opponent has to give you 2 of them. And the other 2 go to your graveyard. Very important that they go to your graveyard because, like we've talked about many times, accessing our graveyard for lands is very easy. And in fact, like the land we talked about earlier, Petrified Field, we actually have a land that we can search for with this card. That also allows us to get lands back from our graveyard. So, really cute card. It's a card I've always enjoyed. And it's always been a stellar card for me in my land stats, especially this one. So yeah, kind of a pet card of mine, but I've always been impressed with this card. And this card's a fun, cool card. Anytime you can, give your opponents choices and they still lose no matter what choice they make, it's always fun. Return of the Wild Speaker, 4 and a green for an instant. Choose one. Draw cards equal to the greatest power among non-human creatures you control, or non-humans you control get +3/+3 until end of turn. We don't have a lot of humans in this deck, so being able to, this will just draw us cards or give us sort of an overrun sort of effect. This is kind of a staple of mono green decks for me, and just like, you know, green based creature decks in general. Love this card. Draws you cards when you need it. Helps kill your opponents when you need it. Just does a lot on an instant speed package. Always like this card a lot. All right, we got 3 artifacts and 3 enchantments, so we're almost at the end here. Then I'll go over some sideboard cards I'm considering adding or recently have taken out. Artifacts, Crucible of Worlds. We've mentioned it before. You probably know what it does. It's 3-mana artifact. You can play lands from your graveyard. We've talked about why this effect is important. We take as many of this effect as we can get. Soul Ring, you know what it does. It's here. Zern Orb, it's a 0-mana artifact. You can sack a land to gain 2 life. It's a super wombo combo with Titania. If you've ever played against Titania, you know how powerful Zern Orb with it. You can sack your whole board and make an army of 5/3s and gain a bajillion life. Zern Orb's just great. Any land stack, but it's good here because we want to recycle our lands, get them back from the graveyard, gain some life along the way. And it's the cost of it is just a free artifact, so this card's kind of goofy and absurd, but we'll take it. It's really great for our deck. And then our 3 enchantments are Burgeoning. Whenever an opponent plays a land, you get to play a land. It's a 1 green mana enchantment. As long as you got lands in your hand, it's going to ramp you like crazy. So Exploration, similar. 1 green mana enchantment. You may play an additional land each of your turns. We want as many of this effect as we can get. This is as efficient of a rate as we can get. And it's an enchantment, so it will very unlikely get removed. Sylvan Library, 1 and a green enchantment. At the beginning of your draw step, you draw 2 additional cards. If you do, you choose 2 cards that were drawn this turn. For each of those cards, pay 4 life, put that card back on your top of your library. So what this card actually does, you probably know, you've probably played it. But you draw 3 cards, and then for each one outside the first you keep, you pay 4 life. So if you want to draw 1 of the 3 cards, you don't pay any life. If you want to draw 2 of those 3 cards, you pay 4 life. If you want to draw 3, you pay 8 life. Tip for this card, if you haven't played with it much, especially if it's early on in the game, you basically always pay 8 life the first time. I know 8 life seems like a lot for 2 cards, but what it does is it helps get you past those cards, and then you actually get to look at the next cards. Because if you keep only drawing 1 card at a time, you're only going to see the one next card. Unless you have fetch lands and you know that you have them in your hand, then you can shuffle those cards away. But especially when you have a large chunk of life and early on in the game, it's pretty important to take your first 8 at least once. I usually take it twice, 3 times. I don't care. As long as I'm above 0, I'm fine with it. Especially if it's for cards. But yeah, Sylvan Library is just one of the best draw cards in green, if not the best. So we play it here. It's super efficient. All right, so that's the deck. That's what I'm currently running. Like I said, I'd like to get in a few more lands, and there's a few cards I'm kind of iffy about still, but I'm trying them. But we'll go over a pretty wide selection of cards here that I am considering. So the first one up is Ancient Tomb. It's a broken land. It taps for 2 colorless mana, and then when you tap it, you take 2 damage. So it's basically like this card's, I'm kind of not playing it right now just for power level reasons, because I don't want like 1,000 broken lands. But I'm probably going to end up adding it because, I don't know, I'm a land stack. It's just a broken land, so I just want to play it. And I'm just going to add it as probably the next land I add for the deck. Like I said, I'd realistically want to get to more of the 45 range, so I'm probably going to end up adding like 3 lands at least. Originally, I was up to almost the 50 land mark. I had like 42 lands and like 4 or 5 modal DFCs. But I've apparently cut some of them, some of the worst ones, and replaced them with just like, you know, land payoff cards or whatever, which normally isn't good practice. But I knew I had so many lands that I wanted to test the cards out, so I cut some bad lands for them in the meantime. But now that I'm more settled on the deck and I feel better about it because I've played probably a couple dozen games with this deck at this point, I feel more solid about it, so I'm ready to put just good lands back in and take some out of the cards I haven't been as impressed with. Next up, Ashaya Soul of the Wild, 3 green for a star. Its power and toughness is equal to the number of lands you control. Non-token creatures you control are force lands in addition to their other types. So what's very important about this card is the creatures that you have that are now forests have different names, and they are lands, so they help trigger your Field of the Dead more reliably. And then whenever you play a creature, it also triggers your Field of the Dead, and so on. So this is definitely a card I want to add, but it's just like, I don't know. I just don't know what to cut for it. I don't know. It's not like necessary. It just helps smooth the game out a lot. But it is cute in like that it protects your creatures from like, cyclonic rifts and stuff. That's also cute. But it's just kind of just a generic big idiot. And I don't really care if my creatures are like mana dorks per se. I mostly just want them to have like different land names and stuff. So I don't know. I'm kind of iffy on this card. I really want to try it, but I just don't know what I should cut at the moment. I don't know. This card, it just doesn't do a ton, but what it does is just kind of cute and really cool. So I do want to try it, but I just don't know where to fit it. And it's really on theme for the Nissa theme. Next up, Bane of Progress, 4 green for an elemental. It's a 2/2 when it enters the battlefield. You destroy all artifacts and enchantments, and then you put a 1/1 counter on this for each permanent destroyed this way. Excellent board wipe in green. Also leaves behind a big threat. Obviously we only have 6 total artifacts and enchantments combined, so we're not going to lose like anything to this ever. But it's not the most fun card to play against, but it is just a good card, so I do want to get it in the deck. I just don't know where. But yeah, it's just a really powerful, good green card. Helps deal with, a bunch of things all at once and without hardly us losing anything. So next up, Beast Whisperer, 2 green for a 2/3 elf druid. Whenever you cast a creature spell, draw a card. We're very creature heavy in this deck. We're at 28 creatures, which is more than plenty to run a Beast Whisperer. But it just doesn't directly pay off our strategy. It just kind of helps us smooth our game plan a little bit. But I don't know. I haven't really found that I've required this card. But if somebody ran it in a very similar deck, I would definitely understand why. But I just like my list how I have it now, and just doesn't seem like a card I'm going to end up adding. Blast Zone. This is probably another one of the next 3 lands I'm going to add. Enters the battlefield with a charge counter on it. It taps for a colorless mana. You can pay XX and tap this to put X charge counters on it. And then what do you do with the counters? Well, you can pay 3, tap, and sack this to destroy each non-land permanent with converted mana cost equal to the number of charge counters on Blast Zone. Just a good utility card. It's pretty mana intensive, but it's modal. You can kind of blow up whatever permanents you need to blow up outside of tokens. Yeah, it's just, and all that's just on an untapped colorless land. So I'm definitely happy to have it. It's going to give me interaction in a land slot, which I'm always appreciative of. So Craterhoof Behemoth, we talked about it earlier. It's boring. It's powerful. If I really wanted to put it in the deck to make it better, then I would. And maybe I do at some point, but that's not right now. Cultivator Colossus, 4 green for a star with trample. It's a plant beast. Its power tough is equal to the number of lands you control. Sounds familiar. When it enters the battlefield, you may put a land card from your hand on the battlefield tapped. If you do, draw a card and repeat this process. This card definitely seems almost like a no-brainer for the deck. But I think that Ulvenwald Hydra might be a better fit for this deck. As I've kind of said, I don't really have a problem in this deck with emptying my hand of lands. Because I have so many ways to play extra lands. I have so many ways to go get lands, and it puts them into play. I can play lands from my graveyard. And, I don't usually have land sitting in my hand. And to kind of start the chain, you have to have a land in your hand, and then you draw a card, and you can put a land into play. Then, I don't think that would happen very much in this deck, even though I am a lands deck and have a lot of lands in the deck and plan on adding more lands. The only reason that I might end up putting this in the deck is because it is a giant trample idiot. So it is a pretty big threat on its own. And it will generally at least produce me a little bit of value. But I don't know. I don't think this is the home for Cultivator Colossus. Even though it seems like a pretty obvious include. I'm not sold on it. It is a card I would like to try, but at the price tag it's at, I don't have one currently, and I'm not really interested in actively looking to pick one up. Maybe at some point when this card is if this card ever gets to the $5 mark or something, then I might pick one up and try it. But this card during its lifetime, I don't think has ever been below $12, $15. So I've never really found the need to pick it up, and I'm not really actively looking to get it at this price tag. And I don't think it would really be that great in the deck. Druid class. This is a card I initially tried in the deck, but was pretty underwhelmed with. But it's a card I thought was cool and wanted to try. It's 1 and a green for an enchantment. It has the subtype of class. When a land enters the battlefield under your control, you gain a life. And then you can pay 2 and a green to make it level 2, and then you can play an additional land each of your returns. And then you can pay 5 mana, and then you make one of your lands into a creature that's prioritized equal to the number of lands you control. Level 1 is just too mediocre. I like that effect, but I'm not willing to pay 2 mana for that effect, you know what I mean? Courser of Crufix obviously does this effect, but it has the much more powerful side of being able to play lands off the top of the deck, which is the main part I care about. And then the extra life gain is the gravy on top, which makes me kind of keep it around. But when it's mostly what it does is gain a life like this, I'm not really too interested in it. I do want to play additional lands each of my turns, but at that point I'm in 5 mana on this card, and I don't know, that's just such an awful rate. And I don't really have early game when I have plenty of lands that I want to play. I don't really have this much mana lying around to invest into this stupid card. So I thought this card looks really cool, and I like what the words say on this card, but the rate on this card is just too bad. So I just ended up cutting it. Next up, Emerald Medallion. It's a 2 mana artifact, and it says green spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. Now, this would be pretty powerful in this deck, as almost every card in our deck's green. We don't have hardly any colorless cards in this deck. So it would allow us to get discounts on basically everything we play. So it could generate 2-3 mana a turn pretty easily. But that being said, it's just kind of an oddball card. It gives us a lot of extra mana lying around. But we kind of already do that. Like, except for outside of early game, we don't have a ton of mana lying around. But every turn after like 5 or 6, we just have tons of mana. We just have to find things to do with it, really. And this card doesn't really help with that problem at all. Sure, it kind of gets us out there a little earlier, but I don't know. I don't know about this card. It would be good in the deck, but it doesn't really synergize with the deck, you know what I mean? It just helps us get more mana, which is like not a bad thing, but it doesn't really help us kind of, get the ball rolling. Next up is Expedition Map. It's a 1 mana artifact. You can pay 2 and tap and sack it to search the library for a land and put it in your hand. This card seems kind of like a no-brainer for this deck, but I don't know. I do want to add it, but I do have quite a few ways to search up any land, and most of them put them into play. So I don't know. This card's just a bit awkward for me. It does the thing I want it to do, but I do have quite a bit of that effect already. That being said, it's never bad to have more of that effect for what I'm doing, because I just have so many lands that do so many things and have so much utility that all of these sort of cards can act like Swiss Army knives. But this card's just a little tough for me to find a spot to fit it in. Like I said, I've played this deck a lot at this point. I'm really happy with what it does. This is kind of quickly becoming a pet deck of mine. So I don't know. I don't know where to fit this card in. I really want to put it in. It seems like a pretty easy include, but I'm just having a hard time finding a slot for it. Maybe I just end up cutting like a Wood Elves or something. I don't know. Something that's kind of boring, but I don't know. I just don't know where to put this card. This is a card that I cut recently, Garrick's Uprising. It's 2 and a green for an enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, draw a card. Creatures you control have trample. When a creature you control with power 4 or greater enters the battlefield, you draw a card. So the thing with this card in this deck is it has a lot of words on it I like, but they don't actually synergize that well with this deck. Most of my creatures are actually not power 4 or greater. I have a handful here or there, but I don't really have them lying around where I'm reliably going to draw a card when this enters or when creatures enter. And then the trample, most of the time I want that when my creatures get big, which most of the things that make them big also give them trample in this deck. So this card has a lot of words that I like on it, but it just doesn't really fit into this build specifically. So it's gotten the axe recently, but it is a super stellar card and will go into a lot of green decks. So yeah. Green Sun Zenith, it's a sorcery. You pay X and green. You search the library for a green creature card with mana value X or less. You put it on the battlefield and shuffle, and then you shuffle this into your library as well. So that once again, this is just kind of a card where I'm just trying not to run it too many tutors because I already search my deck so much, and I already sit there and dirtle around, and I don't know. I feel like I take up enough people's time with this deck from all my searching because a lot of times when I search, I have to look for specific lands, like my untapped like my non-basic forests and this specific fetch land or whatever. So I just try not to run the tutors for that reason, and then also because, like I said, I'm not trying to make this like the most powerful deck. I just want to run cool cards that I like, and then there are some powerful cards in the deck, so this deck will definitely win games. But I don't know. This is just a card that I just don't run for that reason. Speaking of cards, I really want to get into this deck. Another pet card of mine that I absolutely adore. It's Life from the Loam. It's 1 and a green for a sorcerer. You return up to 3 lands from your graveyard to your hand, and then it has Dredge 3, which means instead of drawing it, you can mill 3 and put this into your hand from your graveyard. This card's just so good at bringing lands back from your graveyard, and it just refuels your hand so easily with playing lands, especially if you have fetch lands that you play, and then they immediately go to the graveyard, so then you can cast this again. I love Life from the Loam so much. I really want to find a spot for it in this deck. It will end up in this deck at some point, but I'm kind of finishing the testing phase and moving into the second phase of what I want to do with this deck. So I just got to figure out what I want to fit this in for. But man, I love a Life from the Loam. Rampaging Balos, another recent cut here. 4 green for a trample 6/6 beast. Whenever land enters the battlefield, you make a 4/4 green beast. Notably, the 4/4 that you make here doesn't have trample. This card obviously goes pretty well with Garruk's Uprising. But first I cut the Garruk's Uprising, and then I ended up cutting this just recently. Very, very recently. This is just like I don't know. It's just kind of, it just does a lot of mana investment just for some dorks. The only like actually good dork it makes is it itself is the 6/6 trample. The 4/4s it makes are like not inconsequential, but they're like not good. They're easy to chump block, and I don't know. They just kind of sit there and they just ask to get board wiped and stuff like that. So I don't know. I do like that it has Nissa flavor text on it though. Yeah, this card's just not that good. I was just running it in the deck because it's a fun card and just kind of a goofy green landfall card. But now that I've kind of got more of the synergy cards I want in the deck, this one was an obvious cut to me. Ranger's Path. This is another ramp card that I kind of want to add. It's 3 and a green for a sorcery. Search your library for up to 2 forest cards, put on the battlefield tapped, then shuffle your library. What I'll probably end up doing is cut one of the cultivate effects for this, or one of the like wood elf sort of effects for this, because I do want to put this card in, because being able to search up 2 forest cards is really sweet because I can get my non-basic forests with this. But I don't know. I just was trying to. I've been pretty happy with the low mana ramp, like the 3 mana ones that put the land into my hand, the cultivates and stuff. I don't mind putting the land in my hand because then I'm just going to play it anyway. I probably have extra land drops to hit and stuff anyway. So I figured that those would end up playing out better, which they probably do. But this is definitely a ramp card that I would like to get in the deck. But I don't know. I didn't find space for it yet. But definitely a good one. If I saw somebody running this, obviously I really wouldn't question it much. Restore. Oh, this has been a really fun card in this deck. I reluctantly cut this card, but this card's been very, very fun. It's 1 and a green for a sorcery. You put a land card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. So you can actually take your opponent's lands that are lying around in their graveyard. I've definitely blown some people out with this card. It's been really fun. One of my buddies who was playing a very graveyard-heavy deck, and he had played a Bajuka Bog early on in the game or whatever, exiled somebody's graveyard. I strip-mined his Bajuka Bog, and then I took it with the Restore and exiled his giant graveyard when he's a very graveyard synergistic deck. And he just basically scooped immediately. He was just out of the game. But yeah, very importantly, this card can get any land. Almost always I was getting opponents' lands from their graveyards because it, once again, gives me another land name. Even if it's just like a basic swamp or whatever, I would rather have that than the basic forest in my graveyard because my deck can't produce basic swamps. So it just gives me another land name in the deck. So this card was definitely an overperformer. Always a good card whenever I played it, basically. I almost never had it dead. I could always just get my own fetch land out of my graveyard. But a lot of times I would just grab one of my opponent's lands or whatever, So definitely a card that I would like to add back into the deck. Really fun, really cool card, very unique card. But once again, I've cut it somewhat recently to try out some other stuff, and now I'm just having a hard time finding a way to get it back in. The aforementioned Scavenger Grounds, we talked about it pretty early on in the video, but it taps for a colorless mana, or you could pay 2 tap and sack this to exile all graveyards. Once again, we like to use our graveyard quite a bit, and this is about the only land that exiles graveyards that's not Bojuka Bog. So I would really like to have the utility of being able to reliably get rid of graveyards on a land, because then I can tutor real easy and stuff with all of our land tutors. But I don't know, it's just holding me up because I just really like using my own graveyard. And this itself gets exiled because you sack it as part of the cost. If this didn't exile itself, like if I could keep replaying it from my graveyard, that would be the tipping point for me. Then I would be willing to put it in the deck. But there's not like, this deck plays, there's not very many ways to get instant speed lands back from your graveyard. Most of the time it's play the land from your graveyard, which means it's sorcery speed, so you can't do it in response to the exile effect or anything like that. So I don't know. This card's just on the edge for me. I really want graveyard hate in my land slot, but this is the only way I can do it, and it hurts me a lot. So yeah, I don't know. It's kind of kept it out of my deck for now, but this is definitely a land I'm always considering, and it's always on the fringes for me of adding. So yeah, tough. Shared Summons, another good tutor. 3 and a green for an instant. You search your library for 2 creatures and you put them in your hand. It's an instant speed 5 mana, 5 mana instant speed tutor that puts them right in your hand, which is really sweet. But once again, just not running very many tutors. If I started running tutors, this would be one of the first ones I would go to, because 5 mana is nothing to us, and getting any 2 creatures is pretty big, especially at instant speed. Treasure Vault, land I absolutely adore. It's an artifact land that taps for a colorless mana. XX, tap and sack the Treasure Vault. Create X treasure tokens. So it's a pretty good mana sink on a land. You can kind of store up a ton of mana for the next turn in the form of treasures. And then for us, sacking the land's no big deal. We can just replay it right back again. So one that I've always considered, but I haven't really found the room for it. And I don't know. The payoff may not be worth it enough. I'd much rather run the Blast Zone and the Ancient Tomb first, and probably the next land I'm going to talk about. So yeah. I don't know if I decide to chop another land off out of the deck list that I have or something, or add a 4th land, then this is probably the next one I would go to. But yeah, that being said, War Room is definitely the 3rd land that I'm planning on adding. Taps for a colorless mana. You can pay 3, tap, and pay life equal to your commander's color identity, which is 1, and then you draw a card. So this gives us consistent card draw for not a substantial rate on a land, which is great. If we need things to do, then this gives us things to do when we have tons of mana lying around, which we do a lot of times. So yeah, I love War Room, especially in monocolor decks where you don't even have to lose hardly any life to it. So stellar card. Always love to play it. And then the last card that we're going to talk about today is World Breaker. This is a pet card of mine that I'm planning on adding to the deck. Once again, I just have to find space for it. It's 6 and a green for a 5/7 Eldrazi. It has Devoid, which means it has no color. Even though you have to pay green to cast it. Whenever you cast this, you exile target artifact, enchantment, or land. It has reach, and if you can pay 2 and a colorless mana and sack a land to return this from your graveyard to your hand. So this is real consistent interaction, as well as an excellent blocker. A 5/7 with reach is an amazing blocker for us. And the exile effect, I really love exile effects, especially in green where we don't get a lot of access to it. Artifact, enchantment, or land, that hits most things that we're going to have problems with. Most creatures we can chump block if they're on the ground with our billion zombies. But the air creatures they have, we can block with this. And then we can keep bringing it back and getting more interaction and blocking the big idiots that they have in the air if we have to keep chump blocking, something like that. So pet card of mine. Always love this card. Seems like a great fit for this deck. Seems like it's something I'm looking for sure. Once again, I'm definitely planning on adding it. I just have to find a slot for it. So yeah, that's my deck. Definitely a deck that I've really enjoyed. I love playing land strategies. I love green mono decks especially. I've been playing a lot of monocolor decks lately. I found that now, I used to always love playing 2-color decks because it felt like you had enough restriction in deck building because your colors couldn't do everything. But you still had a wide enough card pool in 2 colors where you had a lot of options. But nowadays, since they print so many cards for Commander, there's a lot of things that like catch all and do more things than they used to in Commander. So I've kind of strayed even more towards monocolor and even been even more restrictive on what I can build. And for me, restriction breeds creativity. It allows me to get more creative and find cool new cards. And even though I may not do something as efficient as another color, the fact that my color can do this thing in this way is really important and cool. So yeah, I've really enjoyed playing monocolor decks. And as I've kind of been playing land stacks, I've been going to fewer and fewer colors. And this is kind of my ode to seeing how far I could push Field of the Dead. And turns out monocolor, which would be probably the hardest color to do Field of the Dead in, is still really not that hard if you're pretty clever about it and you're a good deck builder. So yeah, this has been Nissa Vastwood Seer. I'm Blake, the hipster Highlander. If you enjoyed this video, do all the normal algorithm stuff like we talked about, like, comment, subscribe. I plan on doing videos twice a week, usually on Sunday and then either Tuesday or Wednesday, depending on when I have time. I want to try to keep doing deck lists, deck builds. Depending on which one you'd rather see, if you'd rather see a deck I've already built and played, tell me that. Or if you'd rather see me build new decks with you guys, or brew decks with you guys, give me suggestions on commanders you're maybe thinking about building. Whatever, I'm kind of down for whatever. I'm a builder at heart. I'm a Magic player, and I love talking about the game. So always here, always got time. So thanks for watching. Love y'all. Take care.